If I were to ask you, what was the first UFO abduction? A lot of you might bring up Betty and Barney Hill, or maybe those of you who have watched the Obscure series might even note the segment we did about old abductions that were said to have happened in the late 19th century. But could there be ones even older than that? That brings us to our story, which starts on November 15th, 1572, Kreisbuhl, Switzerland, at a farming village in the foothills of the Swiss Alps, when a 50-year-old farmer, Hans Buchmann, would wake up, put on his wool overcoat and mittens, get his walking stick, and exit the home. The poor family, which consisted of him and his wife and 2 teenage sons, always seemed to be in debt, as Hans had taken several loans to make ends meet, and he was desperate to get his head above water financially. And just by chance, this year's crop had done really well, and it, along with the money he had put back, was finally enough to pay off his debt. So on this unseasonably beautiful morning, one with no snow, he took off down the road to go the 4 miles to finally pay off his loans. The route, unfortunately for Hans, mostly went uphill and through forested terrain, and although this morning had started off as a beautiful day, the temperature was dropping. Actually, it had been dropping over the past few days, but at least he didn't have to deal with the snow at this point. What would happen next is pretty crazy, because this walk, which should have taken 2 hours each way, would keep Hans away from home for almost 3 months. And unfortunately for him, he never told his family exactly where he was going, maybe out of the shame of owing so much money. So where had he gone? That's where it gets interesting. It would be 2 weeks later when Hans would wake up with a splitting headache. He took a look around and seen he was curled up against a stone wall of an alleyway of some city unknown to him, and seemed very strange. He also immediately noticed he was dirty and scruffy. His hat, mittens, overcoat, and walking stick were all gone. Now he was wearing a ragged shirt and loose pants. He walked out into the street, asking everyone, "Where am I? What city is this?" But they all ignored him. I mean, I kinda get it, since he probably came off as an unkempt crazy person, or a drunk beggar, possibly from a different city. Now, as you may have noticed, I stated he had awoken 2 weeks later. But how did he know this? That is because Hans soon realized there were a lot of men, women, and children out on the street going somewhere. They seemed to be following the ringing of church bells to attend Mass. He soon put it together that it was St. Andrew's Day, which was 2 weeks after he had left. Now he was really confused. Finally, he seen a soldier, someone who looked like he had some authority, so he went to speak to him. Hans would say, "Sir, my name is Hans Buchmann. I was traveling to my native city of Sempach, but seem to have lost my way. What city is this?" Hans could not believe his ears when the soldier responded, "This is Milan. You are a long way from Sempach." And he wasn't kidding. It was about 160 miles away, about a week's worth of walking. How did he start off on a 2-mile walk to pay off a debt and end up on the other side of the Alps? He had no idea. Now, luckily for Hans, the soldier who had told him this could only speak to him because he was a foreign mercenary who had come to work from Milan and just happened to be Swiss. He, along with other mercenaries, helped get Hans back on his way home, which he finally reaches in February of 1573, some 3 months after he left. And he looked pretty bad. His head was swollen, he had lost all of his hair, and was basically unrecognizable. When he came back to his family, he was surprised to learn that his 2 teenage boys had set out on the same trail he had taken that day and looked everywhere for him, but all they found was his coat, hat, mittens, and walking stick, which were laying by the roadside at the edge of the forest outside of town. And when they actually went into town, only a few people had stated they had seen him and that he had stopped to have a drink at a tavern, but after that, there were no more sightings. They began to suspect that Hans's cousin, Klaus Buchmann, who had feuded with the family for years, had murdered him, but he ended up being interrogated by authorities and had his property searched and obviously found no signs of Hans. The story was intriguing enough that the local chronicler, which were all over towns in Europe at that time, and the reason we have this account, would go to question Hans about what had happened that day. He would even be interrogated by a local magistrate who began to suspect some kind of foul play or a trick by Hans. Maybe it was all some kind of plot to frame his cousin Claus. Now what's interesting here is we don't know exactly what the debt was over, but since he was spotted at that tavern, it's likely that he had a beer tab that had just gotten really out of control. But that's speculation. What is known is Hans stopped at the home of the man that he owed the money to, a man who owned another bar. But he was not there, which is how Hans ended up at another pub. It's at this point the story gets a little suspect, as Hans told the magistrate he didn't remember how much he had drunk, but it wasn't much. He then left the tavern a few hours later, right before sunset, and decided to go back home and pay his loan back at another time. And it's here, right on the forest trail on the outskirts of town, that he would hear a loud buzzing sound. He looked into the sky to see a bright light, while the buzzing sound began to increase and took on the noise of a swarm of bees, which engulfed him and started moving him towards the light into the sky. Hans recalled that was the last thing he remembered until he woke up 2 weeks later in Milan. The whole thing is strange and really matches up with descriptions of modern day abductions. But what really happened? Well, let's start with the obvious. Was this the first recorded alien abduction ever? It seems very similar to what abductees report today, and it could also explain how he ended up in Milan with a swollen head and no hair, as well as a loss of time. Interestingly, the chronicler of this story had his own theory. He stated he believed Hans was kidnapped by a fairy, which was a very popular folklore explanation in those days. There's also been the proposal that Hans experienced a time slip or dimensional shift, which accounts for the missing time and his arrival in Milan. But let's get to the more mundane theories. It's possible his disorientation may point to some kind of psychotic episode, or even that he simply drank too much and for whatever reason ended up in Milan after going on a big bender, and then he needed a good excuse to tell everyone when he arrived back home, while the swelling in his head could have just been from an infection. Or if that buzzing sound had really been a bee nest, then it may have just been from stings, although I think both of those are a long shot. Finally, a very possible theory is hypothermia. The temperature had been dropping, and it's especially cold that time of the year in the Alps, and he may have not even realized how cold it was, especially if he was drunk. It could have explained why he discarded his coat and gloves, which people suffering from hypothermia tend to do. And then once he collapsed, somebody coming by could have seen him and taken him in and started nursing him back to health, possibly while they were on the road to Milan themselves. Maybe merchants who began to think that Hans was never going to wake up, so they just dumped him off in that alley in Milan and left him there. One night in 1969, Leary, Georgia, a man was preparing to give a speech at a meeting of a club when one of the guests would call for him to come over to a window and look outside. And the man, curious, walked over and looked, and there it was in the sky, a bright white object, almost as bright as the moon. It began moving towards them, but stopped and hovered over a line of pine trees in the distance. It's then this object began to change colors from white to blue, then red, then back to white, before it disappeared in the distance. And in what would seemingly just be another UFO story, this one stands out for one reason. The man that witnessed it, his name was Jimmy Carter, the future president of the United States. Now at the time this occurred, Carter was only a member of the Georgia State Senate, but he had declared his intent to run for governor of Georgia. And it wouldn't be until 4 years later, in 1973, that, after he was governor, he filed his official report, after the International UFO Bureau had heard the story and asked him to. In the report, Carter would state whatever he had seen was emitting the light by itself, and it wasn't the reflection of light off of something on the ground. Likewise, he did not think it was a solid object, suggesting he was intangible, maybe taking on a gaseous form, which is usually reported in ghost sightings. Carter would then state that it was also witnessed by around 10 to 12 people, and likewise, it remained viewable for about 10 to 12 minutes. And none of them could explain what it was they had just seen. Now, as you may have noticed, I did not list an exact date, and that's because that is a source of confusion. When Carter filed his report 4 years after the incident, he stated that it was in October of 1969, but when investigators began digging through the records of those club meetings, They soon realized that the meeting had taken place earlier that year, on January 6, 1969, not in October. Likewise, Carter had made a regular report of this meeting with the club, and he cited a date of January 6th. Yet, nowhere in that report does he ever mention that there was a UFO. So more than likely, Carter was mistaken, and the events did take place in January. So with that being squared away, what the heck did Carter and this other dozen people see? Well, once Carter began running for president, you know the media was going to run down every story possible, and that's what they did here. According to one source, they were able to trace down all the attendees at that meeting, some 7 years after the events, and called every one of them, and only one of them remembered seeing anything. That man's name was Fred Hart. He recalled it being a little blue light, or something like that, moving around in the sky. He suggested that it may have been a weather balloon, but he had actually forgotten all about it until they called him. All of the other attendees stated they could not remember, or if it did happen, he was viewed as insignificant. Now interestingly, Carter stated while he did file a UFO report, he only did so because technically it was unidentified, but he didn't think it was of extraterrestrial origin. And with his training in the Navy, he had a pretty good understanding of physics, and he did not think it was an alien craft. So with that, what did he see? Well, the earliest theory put forward came from ufologist Robert Schaefer, who suggested that what Carter really seen was the planet Venus. This will be backed up by other ufologists who began calculating exactly where Venus would have been in the sky on that very night. However, Carter himself would dispute this in 2007 in an interview with the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast. He said he knew it wasn't Venus, as he was an amateur astronomer and had viewed Venus before. Furthermore, he said as a scientist, he did not believe it was an alien craft at all, and instead was probably some kind of military aircraft. He would go on to note that it did not make a sound like you would hear from a helicopter, although it sort of moved like one. He also stated he didn't believe aliens ever visited Earth and that he didn't know of any government cover-up. And he also shot down the long-held rumors that the CIA refused to give him information about UFOs. The same podcast would receive a letter from the Carter family in 2016, one they had received from someone else and they had just forwarded. Basically, it came from a man named Carl, who claimed that in the 1960s and 70s, he worked on an Air Force project that studied the upper atmosphere using releases of glowing chemical clouds launched by rockets in Florida. And in this project, they had to always launch them after sunset or before sunrise to be able to view them. He felt that this is what Carter had seen, as those clouds often glowed blue or green and then became red. They would also appear bright and about the size of the moon. Of course, this was just some random person that sent this letter to the Carter family, and none of this has been verified, but it's very possible this is the explanation. But it's worth pointing out, Carter pledged to tell the truth about UFOs once he became president, but after getting elected, he backed off, citing national security concerns. One could take this to mean that it had more to do with his secret weapons program, or possibly that he was told to hush about UFOs and aliens. In fact, there's this long-held story that the CIA informed Carter about the truth of UFOs and aliens, and he began to weep because it challenged his deep Christian faith. Of course, none of this can be verified either, and it's long been held as fiction. October 24th, 1961, Lincoln, Massachusetts. 31-year-old Joan Risch would go over next door to her neighbor, Barbara Baker, at about 2 p.m. It was here she brought her daughter, Lillian, over to play with Barbara's little boy, Douglas, on the swing set. Joan would then tell Lillian and Douglas that she would be right back and walked across the street back to her home. But after about an hour and a half, at around 3:40 p.m., Barbara would go outside and get Lillian and take her back home because she had to take her own children out to the store to pick up a few things. So she walked Lillian over to the yard and watched her go inside, and then went back into the home herself, grabbed her children, and drove off. She was only gone about 35 minutes when she pulled back up, and Lillian walked back over, as if she had been waiting on her. When Barbara checked on Lillian, she said, "Mommy is gone, and the kitchen is covered in red paint," which sounds pretty eerie. Barbara didn't know what to think, and so she walked back over to Joan's, and when she got to the door, she could hear Lillian's little baby brother, David, crying in his crib. She would slowly step in, and Lillian was right. Mostly, Joan was gone. But this wasn't red paint, which was all over the home. It was blood. She would immediately check on David, who was just crying because he needed a diaper change, and grab him and went out the door and went back home to call the police. And it didn't take long for them to arrive, as a Sergeant Mike McHugh was on site within 5 minutes. He observed blood smears over the walls and noted an overturned table, and the handset of a wall-mounted telephone ripped loose and thrown into a basket that had been set in the middle of the floor. For whatever reason, Sergeant McHugh immediately suspected suicide, and he began looking over the home, but when he could not find Joan's body, he decided to call for backup to search the surrounding area. Soon, this entire small town's police force was on the case, calling up hospitals looking for Joan. Barbara, meanwhile, was trying to locate Joan's husband, Martin, since he was nowhere to be found. And after calling his employer, she learned he was in New York on business. She finally got a hold of him, and he, of course, got on a flight back home. Meanwhile, investigators searched for more clues and soon found that the mail had not been taken in, along with the phone book opened up in the kitchen that was eerily on the page where emergency numbers could be written down, as 911 wouldn't a thing yet. But in this spot, where she could have wrote the police and fire department's number, nothing had been written. Curiously, they also found an empty liquor bottle, which Martin would explain later on that him and Joan had drank the night before. But they found these empty beer bottles that Martin couldn't explain. Finally, a trench coat was found in the home that Joan had been seen wearing earlier, along with a pocketbook. But speaking of her wearing that trench coat earlier, what exactly had her day look like up until that point? For that, we have to go back to early that morning, when Joan awoke with Martin to get him ready for his flight, which departed out of New York at 8 a.m. After Martin had left to the airport, she woke the children up and made them breakfast. It was after this she took her baby David over to Barbara's house, while she ran Lillian to a dentist appointment. Then afterwards, she went to a department store. Now, as mentioned, the mail had been delivered, but not checked, so police tracked down the postman, and he relayed that Joan was not home when he dropped the mail off, but he didn't notice anything unusual at the time, which was confirmed by the milkman who also delivered around the same time and seen nothing unusual. It would be sometime after that, around 11:15 a.m., Joan would arrive at Barbara's house and pick up David and went back home. At about that time, a man showed up to collect Martin's suits to be taken to the dry cleaner, and this guy was eventually traced down, and he had also not seen anything unusual. Joan would make the kids lunch after this and put the baby down for a nap. At about 1 p.m., Barbara would bring her little boy Douglas over to play with Lillian. While she was watching them in the yard, she seen Joan come out and prune some plants. And this is where we come back to the beginning of the story, when Joan took Lillian and Barbara's kid back across the street and told them she would be right back. Now this is where things would get strange, because there seems to have been some kind of confusion between the two parents. Because 15 minutes after Joan took the children back over to Barbara's yard and walked back, Barbara would record that she looked out across the street to see Joan wearing a trench coat and moving quickly up her driveway with her arms extended out, carrying something red from her car towards the garage. Barbara thought she was playing a game with the children, like she was chasing them, but unbeknownst to Barbara, both kids were in her backyard playing on the swing set, and from where they were at, they could not see what was going on either. But after seeing Joan run up her driveway at 2:15 p.m., it would be at 3:40 p.m. when she would finally realize that the kids were in her yard playing, and that's when she walked Lillian back over and let her go in the home, and then she went to the store herself and came back, and Lillian ran out, and then she found the bloody scene. What happened in that time is the mystery, because unfortunately for Barbara, the only thing she had seen was Joan taking something from her car to her garage with her arms extended. But there was one other key witness to all this, another little girl named Virginia Keene, who was also next door neighbors. Apparently, When she had gotten off the school bus and began walking home, she seen a car in the neighborhood she had never seen before. She said it was dirty and had 2 colors, one being blue, and stated it might have been a car made by General Motors. So logically, investigators began to ask other neighbors about this vehicle, and that's when another resident confirmed her sighting. And in fact, this neighbor had spotted the car just 5 minutes after Virginia, and this neighbor said, from their viewpoint, this car pulled up and stopped to let another car out of the driveway, but he wasn't sure which driveway, but it was either the driveway of Joan or of the Keynes family. But since Virginia was right there, she, along with her mother, clarified that there was no car in their driveway at the time, thus meaning someone backed out of Joan's driveway in front of this car and left. So pretty strange, huh? But that's really only the beginning. As they began to interview other neighbors, they found more sightings. About 30 minutes after Barbara had seen Joan running in the driveway, in which she thought she was playing with the kids, another witness seen a woman wearing clothes similar to what Joan had been seen wearing. And what's crazy is she had a bandana over her head, which tied to her chin. She seemed to be wandering around, and she looked unkempt. She also appeared as if she was cold. And then, 30 minutes later, this same similar dressed woman was seen with blood running down her legs and was walking north up the highway. Again, the woman was reported to be disoriented, but this time, she was also seen cradling something at her stomach. And finally, an hour later, the woman was spotted again and again, described in similar circumstances. Meanwhile, police were also trying to find this vehicle that the neighbors had seen. And remember that milkman? Yeah, he actually ended up having some good information. When he had dropped off the milk to Joan's house about 5 days earlier, a car fitting that description was parked there. There would also be 2 more important sightings of that vehicle. One when a witness saw a man get out of a car around 4:15 p.m. to cut some branches from a few trees and stuff them in his vehicle. This was around the same area and time that the confused woman was seen walking around. Likewise, there was another sighting of a man in a similar vehicle around the same area and time that the woman was first reported seen wandering around. So detectives had a very weird and concerning trail to follow. But at least the crime scene would give a lot of clues, right? Well, not really. First of all, there was a lot of blood, but there was no way for investigators to determine what had happened. Was she shot, stabbed, or something else? They just couldn't tell. They did note that there was blood on the phone, so she may have tried to call emergency services. They also found bloody fingerprints, but had none of Joan's to compare them with. They also seen paper that had been used to wipe up blood, possibly from someone's hand, as well as some baby clothing which had been used to try and clean up. Most notably, a pair of coveralls had been used and appeared to have been pressed into the floor, possibly by a body which had laid there for some time. Now interestingly, looking over the blood in the kitchen, investigators determined it actually was the scene of someone who had gotten injured and was trying to prop themselves up while they staggered around the room. Although they couldn't rule out that it was the scene of a brutal struggle, this leaned more to an accident. But going against this was blood drops on the stairs, and in the master bedroom, and in the children's bedroom. It also ran out of the kitchen and into the driveway, where it ended at Joan's car, which was still sitting there. And there was blood in 3 separate places, one at the right fender, one at the left side of the hood near the windshield, and one at the very center of the trunk. Detectives, just as I am, were very confused, but they would not be given any breaks because they couldn't determine how this started or where it ended. Because of all the blood, it may have started upstairs, in the kitchen, or maybe even in the driveway. And as far as her leaving, did she go under her own power, have help, or taken by force? Well, they did bring in dogs to track the scent, and they could only find her scent running back and forth between her and Barbara's house. And considering her car was still in the driveway, and Joan was not around, did someone pick her up? It was possible, but what about all those witnesses seeing a woman walking around? That was it. Investigators couldn't rule out that she just walked off injured. Now here's where things would get very interesting. Despite this widespread scene of blood, which was spread from the driveway to the kitchen and 2 bedrooms, there was not much blood. Actually, only half a pint, nowhere near close to life-threatening. In fact, when you donate blood, they take about 1 pint, which suggested Joan's injuries were not as bad as first expected. This only got more intriguing when a local reporter covering the case soon went to the local library to do some research on similar cases, and that's when she checked out a book about the disappearance of one of Brigham Young's wives, which was odd because when she looked at the signatures to see who all had checked out that book, Joan's name was there, as she had just checked it out a month prior. Then, she found a book called Into Thin Air, about a woman who left blood smears and a towel behind and then vanished. And that book had also been checked out by Joan recently. Soon, a group of volunteers began looking through the records and discovered Joan had taken out 25 books that summer, which mostly had to do with murders and missing people. Now, it seemed that she may have staged the entire thing, but no one was for sure, and while the reporter speculated she did all this to escape a life that she was not happy with, Joan's friends would dispute it, claiming she was very happy as a housewife and a mom and would never abandon her family. This has led some to suggest she suffered an injury in the home and became disoriented. This would match up with the sightings of the woman seen walking around the area. It's even possible she was walking around confused and fell into a hole along the highway, as there had been a lot of construction going on that summer, and it's possible she just ended up being buried accidentally during all the excavation. Martin, for his part, would not do many interviews on the subject, although the few times he did, he always speculated that Joan was alive and had amnesia or a mental breakdown and could not remember how to get home. However, there are those that still believe, actually the majority, that she was abducted, for a few different reasons. For one, she had just taken her daughter and Barbara's boy over to Barbara's home and did not notify her that she was leaving the kids there. There was also no signs of a struggle outside the home, and the kids were left unharmed, but investigators could never find any enemies or anyone they thought would be involved. Likewise, why abduct her after such a bloody scene that seemingly required this person to stick around and try to clean it up? Wouldn't it have just been much simpler to have left her there? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Which brings us to the next theory: a stalker. Someone that had been observing her for days and took her by surprise. Maybe someone that had even scoped the house out while she was gone, but no one's seen anything of that nature, other than that one car that was driving around that no one recognized. And of course, that doesn't explain all those sightings. Others have suggested that it was a botched abortion, or maybe she was having an affair and got pregnant, which led to a violent reaction from the other man. Or maybe she wanted an abortion and he didn't, or maybe they both did and it ended up going bad. But there's zero evidence for this. There wasn't even any rumors of the sort, and it seems like she would have at least told one person in her life that she was pregnant if that was the case. And also, you would think she wouldn't try to pull this off while her daughter Lillian was right across the road playing and knew she could return within a few minutes. This is one of the most confusing cases we've ever covered, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did Joan plot her own disappearance, or was this an accident, or something sinister? Let me know down below. July 13th, 2012, Evansdale, Iowa. Two young cousins, 8-year-old Elizabeth Collins and 10-year-old Lyric Cook Morrissey, would be taken over to their grandmother's house to spend a little time with her. It was by all measures a beautiful sunny day. Because of that, the two decided to go on a bike ride. It would be around noon when they departed from the home of their grandmother and took off up the road towards a nearby lake, about 1.5 miles away. This place was known widely in the area as a location where locals got together to fish, swim, and boat, and it's here the girls would be spotted by some of the other people in town. However, their grandmother expected them back within an hour, but as time wore on and they didn't show up, she got worried. Was this two girls that had simply lost track of time, or something else? Well, their grandmother actually didn't waste any time. She began calling friends and family to see if the girls had showed up there. And it wasn't a bad idea, as this was a really small town of 5,000 people, and she figured more than likely they went to a friend's or family member's house, but that didn't happen. And now, the wider family knew that these girls had been gone for over 2.5 hours, and they didn't wait any longer. They called the police. and the police took it seriously right off the bat, and they responded with a search that began looking over a wider area. This included a few parks and schools, where it was thought the girls may have went to play. Nothing was found right away though, but later that evening, the girls' bikes were finally located, along with Elizabeth's purse, where they sat at the corner of a lake. However, the girls were nowhere to be found, nor was there any trace of what had happened to them. Obviously, there was a possibility that the two could have fell in the lake, and the police would search all around it for signs of that, but found nothing. And although many felt that they probably fell in, some were unconvinced. Actually, there's no bigger sign of that belief than the fact that the FBI joined the search. They would eventually send their divers down into the lake in an effort to try and rule out that the girls had fell in, and the divers found nothing. Afterwards, there was an attempt to drain the lake, which came up a little bit short. What they were able to drain revealed nothing. Now detectives were stuck. Did these girls fall in the lake and had simply not been located yet, or something more sinister? No one knew. Even bringing out cadaver dogs and performing aerial searches with infrared gave no clues. The search remained intense over the next couple of weeks. When the first break came, that's when they found a surveillance video which showed the girls less than a block away from their grandmother's house at 12:11 p.m. Although there were no other clues on the video, police were now at least confident of their timeline. However, the case would soon go cold. It was like these two had vanished into thin air, and I'm sure it really hurt the families, but what came next was even more heartbreaking, because about 5 months later, some hunters were out in a local forest when they came across two bodies that would eventually end up being identified as Elizabeth and Lyric. And the crazy part was, they were 25 miles away from where they had went missing. So how did they get here? That would be the key question to all of this, because this area where they were at saw very few people, especially during the summer. Now in fall, that's a different story. That's when deer hunters come out, while in the spring, often brought people out to search for mushrooms. Otherwise, there was hardly anybody ever here in the summer or winter. And what makes it even more odd is the spot these girls were located at in this forest seemed to be pretty remote. Like, the hunters usually didn't even go to this spot, so the fact that they stumbled over it was a miracle. So that fact alone pretty quickly suggested to investigators that if the girls were tricked or forced into going to this location by someone, he was almost assuredly a local. While someone passing through couldn't be completely ruled out, it was very unlikely. So in this small town of 5,000 people, where should law enforcement look? The obvious answer always starts with the ones closest to the victims, and in this case, the family were easy targets. Mainly Lyric's father, Dan Morrissey. He was not a suspect, but that's only because he was already in prison on meth charges, and for assaulting Lyric's mother, whom eventually divorced him. And the rumor swirled that Dan owed somebody a lot of money due to the drug trade, and since Dan had not paid, and could not since he was in prison, well, he had to be punished by doing something to his daughter and niece, something Dan has repeatedly denied, and he's probably telling the truth, because the FBI looked in a different direction. They instead believed it had nothing to do with drugs, and was more than likely a local who was a predator. Actually, the case is hauntingly similar to that of the Delphi murders, two young girls engaged in a harmless activity like biking in a small, quiet Midwestern town, and the investigators actually believed that the motives in both cases were pretty much the same. Although, in the case of Elizabeth and Lyric, the bodies were not discovered until about a half a year later. A criminal profile was created by the FBI, which suggested the suspect possibly attempted abducting before, and he may have also changed his appearance after the murders. And just like with the Delphi murders, the cause of death is being kept secret until they can find the killer. It's been over a decade now, and the task force has followed up on over 2,000 leads, and if these have ever amounted to anything, they've never disclosed it. There's also been 2 men that have even confessed, and were investigated and ruled out. And as far as suspects go, none have ever been publicly named. Heck, there's not even any persons of interest. Although, online sleuths are convinced that a felon named Michael Klunder, who was a scumbag that had abducted 2 girls in Dayton just a year later before ultimately killing one and then himself, was responsible. But law enforcement have ruled him out and can conclusively put him far enough away at the time of the crime that there was no way he could have done it. And the most likely theory now that some random predator who is hiding in plain sight and has still not been identified is the responsible party. And it's just possible this person was involved in some kind of local industry which put him out in the remote area, say like a logger or maybe a farmer, and he used that knowledge of this location to hide the remains. Lesser believed theories include someone passing through town and took advantage of the situation and fled immediately, although this one seems unlikely considering the remoteness of where the bodies were located, and it would have taken a lot of planning. August 19th, 1985, Frankford, a neighborhood in Philadelphia, would awake to the terrible news that employees for the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority had came across the body of a deceased woman who had not only been murdered, but in a grisly way. The victim was 52-year-old Helen Patton, whose body had been stabbed 47 times in the head and chest and left nude from the breast down, with her legs parted in a lurid way. Investigators who had worked murders before had never seen anything like this, as Helen had been left with this deep gash that ran along her stomach, which revealed her internal organs. It was sickening, to say the least, and you would hope it would be a one-off from a sick individual, but this was sadly only the beginning of a reign of terror from a serial killer that has seemingly fell through the cracks. There's not even much information about him online today, but we do know some things, like he would only be 5 months later when on January 3rd, 1986, 68-year-old Anna Carroll was discovered in the bedroom floor of her home, nude from the waist down. She had 6 stab wounds. One of these was from the butcher's knife that was still lodged in her chest. After this, the mysterious suspect would take one of those so-called cool-down periods, and he laid low until Christmas of that year when 64-year-old Susan O'Sheff was found stabbed to death. This was followed just a couple of weeks later on January 8th when 28-year-old Jean Durkin, a homeless woman, was found stabbed 74 times. She had also been sexually violated and left wrapped in an overcoat. The next confirmed one would again come after a self-imposed cool-down period when the killer struck almost 2 years later on November 11th, 1988, when 66-year-old Margaret Vaughn had been stabbed to death in her own apartment. And I know it sounds like a broken record at this point, but we move ahead 2 more months to January 19th, 1989, when Teresa Ciartino would be found stabbed to death and wearing nothing but her socks. These are known as the 6 canonical Frankford Slasher murders, and they're pretty gruesome. But there are a few more victims that may or may not be connected, which I will come back to. First, let's go to the investigation. Surprisingly, it took detectives a while to realize that we're dealing with a serial killer, in spite of the fact that all the murders were done in a gruesome fashion, along with every one of them having been sexually violated. You would think it would be simple, but it took to the 3rd victim, Suzanne O'Sheff, for detectives to even begin thinking that the cases might be connected. But by the 4th one, Jean Durkin, who had also been stabbed an insane 74 times, detectives would finally realize they had a serial killer on their hands, which makes their next decision all the more confusing. They chose to lie to the media and public, and claimed there was no serial killer and that these murders were all unrelated isolated incidents. And they got lucky too, because as soon as they said this, the Frankford Slasher went on one of his cool-down periods, so the public kind of forgot about it and believed that there was no serial killer. But when he came back the following year and took Margaret Vaughn's life, police could no longer hide the truth. Everyone knew this was more than random acts of violence, and there was actually some very good documented evidence that goes back to a place called the Golden Bar, or Goldie's to the locals. It's here that the majority of victims seem to hang out, which gets to the next point. These victims were those that had seemingly lived on the edges of society. Some of them were sex workers, while others were described as being barflies, as they were known to frequent other bars as well. And of course, some were homeless, or were one check away from being homeless. But there was even more evidence pointing to a serial killer. Witnesses started to come forward and mention seeing victims, Margaret Vaughn and Teresa Ciartino, hanging out with a middle-aged white man, which led to this sketch being circulated around the city. And investigators did identify a man that they thought might actually be the culprit, and they interviewed him one time, and he told them he was a minister. They took a DNA sample, and he left, and would eventually move away. But now that the neighborhood was on alert for a suspicious-looking middle-aged white man, one that liked to hang out at bars, they would surely be shocked at the news they would receive next. When 3 months after Teresa's murder, a 46-year-old mentally ill woman, Carol Dowd, was found stabbed 36 times behind a seafood market. The next morning, detectives began questioning people that worked there, and soon talked to an employee named Leonard Christopher. And Leonard offered what he thought might help, a piece of information, but it was odd. He claimed he had known one of the previous victims, and said that he and his girlfriend were at his apartment at the time of the murder of Carol, and they had seen a stocky white man walking around the seafood store. So when they followed up on this information with Leonard's girlfriend, she was surprised cause she had not even been with him on that night. That's when it began to pile up on Leonard, because 2 witnesses came forward and put him at the scene of the crime around the time of the murder, and said he was carrying a utility knife which he tucked in his belt. Then Leonard's former boss came forward and stated that Leonard told her, "Maybe I did kill her." Now what's crazy about all this is, Leonard was a black man, not white like the suspect was supposed to be, or at least what everybody thought. So was this a mix-up or what? Well, Leonard's boss would actually recant her statement almost immediately, and she was arrested. Meanwhile, the witnesses who saw Leonard with the utility knife were both sex workers and drug addicts, and their word was deemed not as credible. Likewise, it's worth pointing out, another witness claimed to have seen Leonard in the area with a middle-aged white man. And to make a long story short, Leonard would be arrested, charged, and was actually convicted. Basically, on the account of those 2 eyewitnesses, who Leonard claimed were pressured by the police to testify because there was no physical evidence linking him. He, however, was not charged with the other Frankford slayings. And remember how I said there were other murders that may or may not have been connected to the Frankford Slasher? Yeah, one of those actually happened while Leonard was in jail awaiting trial. A 38-year-old, Michelle Martin, who was found stabbed 23 times in her apartment, meaning there was no way Leonard could be the slasher. It also means there's a good chance he was innocent anyways. He would, however, die in prison after a battle with cancer, and he always maintained his innocence. However, police disputed this and claimed that the last murder of Michelle while Leonard was in jail was actually a copycat. There's also another murder that I had not touched upon, that of Catherine Jones, a 27-year-old who had been killed in January 1987 after Jean Durkin. Her murder has never been conclusively linked because the MO was different. There was no stabbing or sexual violation. Instead, she had just been strangled. 4 decades later, and the brutal murders are still unsolved. As far as suspects and theories go, most believe now that Leonard Christopher suffered a great injustice and was arrested largely on the fact that the pressure on the police was immense and they just wanted an arrest. And it might have been racially motivated. The minister, whose name has never been released, seemed like a good suspect, but in recent years, law enforcement have told media that they now have DNA evidence. And I would think, since they have the minister's DNA, that they should be able to confirm or rule him out. But investigators have remained silent on the issue. Regardless, the minister died after he left the area, so he could not be charged if he was responsible anyways. Also, it's worth pointing out, the murder stopped after he moved. Some have suggested, however, that the real suspect was neither the minister nor Leonard, and instead, someone that the investigators have never even been on the trail of. There's also the slight possibility that not all the murders came from one individual, and that there were 2 or more suspects, or copycats. But this seems doubtful since the victims seem to travel in a similar circle, and I would guess again, the DNA probably links to one suspect. Another suggestion often brought up is that the detectives knew exactly who it was, and this person may have been law enforcement, or close to someone that was. This often gets brought up in cold cases, so I'm not sure, but there have been accusations of mishandling of evidence and corruption in this investigation. Hey guys, you know what time it is. It's time for Small Mystery Roundup. This is the segment where we take the mysteries from this iceberg that don't have a lot of data, or don't fit the video really well, or just aren't interesting. We start with Hermes Trismegistus. Hermeticism is a spiritual and philosophical tradition rooted in ancient text which is attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical figure blending the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. It explores universal truths and emphasizes themes such as divine knowledge, the interconnectedness of the universe and people, as well as alchemy and transformation and hidden mystical wisdom for the people that want to look for it. It's basically a way to uncover deeper truths and understand the unity of all things. And the mystery is, did Hermes really exist? And the most common theory is that he didn't, and instead, it was a bunch of different texts written by different people that were then discovered and attributed to Hermes. Herxheim. Herxheim is a Neolithic archaeological site in Germany, dating back about 7,000 years. It is notable for its unique discoveries, such as human bones showing signs of butchering and processing, as well as pottery from far distances. The site consists of pits arranged in a circular pattern where artifacts and remains are buried. These findings suggest the site had a specific, possibly ritualistic purpose over a relatively short period of time, that of 50 years, rather than it being a long-term settlement. As far as theories, some propose it was just ritualistic cannibalism, as evidenced by the defleshed human bones, potentially part of a religious or ceremonial practice. Some think it might have been for more complex mortuary rituals though, like a place to make sacrifices, or possibly it could be tied to warfare. And of course the last theory is that the cannibalism could have been in response to famine or some kind of societal collapse. And of course, what small mystery segment would be complete without a pooper story? This one comes from Hampton, Illinois. It started at some point in 2013 and involved somebody going to a bike path, stopping and letting go, and would then cover it up with tissue and get away before anybody caught him, or her. The first article popped up online in 2015, which means it was already a problem for 2 years at that point. The residents, who were getting fed up with it, even had to go get a sign to hang up which said, "Stop pooping on the bike path." Now what's really goofy in this one is there was a bathroom nearby, and this person was still doing it. So to me that means he just really hates bikers. Alright guys, that's it of the small mysteries. Let's get back to the program. February 27th, 1993, 27-year-old Gary Sudbrink, a captain in the Air Force stationed in San Antonio, Texas, decided to plan a trip going back home, back to where he grew up in Long Island, New York. It would be a chance to see and surprise his family along with his friends, so he did not bother calling them ahead of time. But when he got to the airport, I imagine his only concern was hoping that it didn't take too long to get on board. That would be the least of his issues, because while standing around waiting to depart, some man approached Gary with a clipboard and asked him his name, how to spell it, and where he was going, along with other personal information. Gary thought this was someone trying to sell him something, so he ignored him and got on the plane. Shortly after, another guy approached Gary, also carrying a clipboard, and he sat right next to him and began to question him for the same personal information again. So Gary politely asked the man to leave him alone. About that time, the stewardess approached and asked the man with the clipboard if she could see his ticket. When he showed her, she told him he was in the wrong seat and he would have to move, to which he did. However, after the coast was clear, he got up and sat behind Gary, where he continued to prod him for information again, before the stewardess once again asked him to move. This shook Gary up, and who wouldn't be a little concerned after that? So when he landed, he called his landlord back in Texas and asked him to keep an eye on his apartment while he was away. Meanwhile, he took off towards his parents' house, and once he arrived and spent time with them, he decided to call his good friend Mike to surprise him by telling him he was in town. But when he did, Mike replied, "What are you talking about? You already told me yesterday you were coming to New York." Gary, of course, was perplexed, because he knew he hadn't called him, and began discussing it with Mike. And soon they came to the realization that someone had called Mike pretending to be Gary, and Mike swore it was not some kind of practical joke. He was serious. Gary, still bewildered by the man on the flight, just chalked everything up to a weird coincidence. But this is when things got interesting. While Gary was on the phone with Mike, he got another call, which ended up being from an unlisted number. And when Gary answered, a robotic-sounding voice would ask, "Is Gary Sudbrink there? How long are you back from Texas? You are being impersonated by the other voice." The call would be disconnected, but this robot-sounding person called again at 11 p.m., stating, "Keep an eye on the skies," and near Orion, and the full moon. That's when Gary's father, who was a ufologist, jumped on the call and immediately began speculating about it being extraterrestrial in nature. Another call came in 30 minutes later stating, "Show double from you, keep an eye on the skies, and beware government interference." After this, Gary's father and uncle were convinced that this was the work of an intergalactic being. He would be followed up on the next night in what would be the longest and strangest call they would receive. This time, the caller stated, "We come to be within this planet," and "government interference, visitations to be disrupted," and ended with the strange phrase, "The sun will rise on the dark side of the moon." Let's take a listen to some of these so you can get a better idea.
Yes. I'll tell you who it is.
Hello?
Yeah. Do you want to speak to him?
There's Gary's Sudbrink in there.
Yeah, who's this? Steven? Are you playing games with me or what? Huh? Steven, if you're playing games, I'm going to kick your ass.
So how long are you going to be back from Texas?
Huh?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
Yeah, this is you, Steven, you idiot. You're pissing me off. Jerk. I'm going to get you on... Let's see what it says. Review. One new call out of area. Is Steven out of the area?
How long are you going to be back from Texas?
Wait, say that again?
You're being impersonated by the other voice.
So kinda weird, huh? Well, it gets stranger, because Gary's brother Steven would, after all this, be reminded of a separate strange incident that happened about a year prior. Driving down the highway, he looked over to see the same exact model vehicle Gary drove, and soon enough, he seen Gary making faces at him, which made sense because both were en route to a family member's wedding. But when Steven got there and brought it up to Gary about passing him on the highway and him making faces, Gary was stunned, because he had been at the wedding most of the day. Actually, he hadn't been on the road for hours, so just who did Steven see? Now Gary wondered if these calls, and that incident, and the people at the airport were all connected somehow. He wondered if he had a doppelganger, or imposter, or maybe it was the work of some kind of extraterrestrial. Interestingly, Gary is to this day skeptical about the whole thing, and he believes someone pranked him, although he doesn't know who. And he's also stayed low-key about it, not really pushing to have his story out there, so it seems likely he was not the source of the hoax. But what are the theories? The main one seems to be that the whole thing was a prank by Gary's friends in the Air Force. For one, they were well aware of Gary's dad's obsession with UFOs, and they also knew that Gary was visiting New York, which is why they knew the right questions to ask Gary. It suggested they done it by using a handheld cassette player, which they had already recorded various phrases on, and then they played them at a much slower speed, giving it that robot effect, and possibly making it sound like Gary's voice. Of course, this doesn't explain why they abruptly stopped the prank, or never told Gary. Others suggest that Gary's dad, or uncle, whom were both ufologists, were behind the whole thing, either as a way to prank Gary, or maybe to try and bring him into the UFO world with them. Of course, they didn't know he was coming in, since it was a surprise visit, so I'm not sure how prepared they could have been. Likewise, why didn't they keep trying if that was the case? Nor does this explain the strange guy on the plane or at the airport. Others think that a neighbor or someone that just knew Gary's family, especially his dad and his UFO obsession, decided to prank them. But again, what about the guy at the airport or on the airplane? And finally, the most bizarre theory, Gary had a stalker, maybe one from his everyday life, or someone from his past that had a motive to try and make him feel threatened or worried, or just to cause him stress in general. And that brings us to the end of part 28 of the Unsolved Mystery Mega Iceberg Explained. We are about 1/3 of the way through layer 9. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.